Thank you. It's good to be here. So Jessie Trail was born in Brighton, Melbourne in 1881. She studied at the National Gallery School in Melbourne, which was actually in this building, in the front of this building, from 1901, and she began classes in etching with John Mather in 1903. In 1907, she studied with Frank Brangwyn in London and France and developed the use of tone, which was to become characteristic in her etchings. And you can see some examples of that there, where she's wiped the plates selectively to get that range of tone from the quite bright whites right down to the dark areas. On her return to Australia in 1909, she applied this technique to the landscape that she knew so well, the shores of Port Phillip Bay and Melbourne scenes and surrounds. With her sister Jessie, she bought land at Harkaway in the foothills of the Dandenongs, with a house called Hafra. In a letter to her mentor, Tom Roberts, Jessie wrote, "We have only 5 acres of land, but every bit of it paintable." By 1914, just before the war broke out, Jessie had produced an extensive body of work with a lyrical, fresh vision of the Australian landscape, and she'd held her first solo exhibition. But when war was declared between Germany and Britain, Jessie quickly put her affairs in order, and in December 1914, she sailed to England to volunteer with the Voluntary Aid Detachments, which assisted medical staff in caring for injured soldiers. She trained at Gifford House in London. Over the next 2 months, she was involved in washing, comforting, and preparing meals for soldiers. She produced a humorous cartoon version of her day duties and her night duties. These are all held here in her papers in the State Library of Victoria. There's a wonderful collection here. In July 1915, Jessie was posted to Rouen in France at number 12 Stationary Hospital, which was part of the casualty evacuation chain. They were located further back than the casualty clearing stations near railway lines on the way to the coast, so that patients could be moved for longer-term treatment in Britain. Number 12 consisted of tents on the racecourse at Rouen. At first, things were fairly quiet. In August 1915, Jessie wrote in her diary, "I have been here 2 weeks now, but still feel quite in a dream. It is all so new and interesting, but not a bit as I imagined. Just think of camping at Waratah Bay and living in the camp at Broadmeadows, and you will get an idea. Only mix a very little of Waratah and a lot of Broadmeadows, and you have it. The surroundings here are beautiful, and there are lots of walks for off days." During the time that Jessie spent there, she wrote letters back to her sister Elsie describing her experiences, and she later wrote these up into diary form, which I'm very grateful for, because then she typed it, whereas the very early stuff is handwritten, very difficult to read. In 1916, Jessie was transferred to number 8 General Hospital in the north of Rouen at Bois-Guillaume. She spent the rest of the war there and became very busy with waves of convoys coming through from the front. Her response to Frank Crozier, who was one of her fellow students at the art school, his news of painting, is actually her only reference to art during her time in war-torn France. 6th of September 1915, she writes, "Crozier writes from Egypt. Seems to find plenty of time to do some painting. Really, I feel amazed. If I gave up writing letters or reading or taking exercise, I might be able to get a few odd hours a week, but I would not call that good enough." And the particular medium that she worked in, printmaking, etching, is very time-consuming, so it's not the sort of thing you can just pick up and do a quick bit of. There was a high turnover of staff in the hospitals, and Jessie was one of quite a small minority who stayed through the whole war. If nurses became ill, they were cared for at a nearby chateau they called the Six Sisters Hospital. And I was very fortunate to actually stay there last year. It's owned privately now. Jessie made some lifelong friends, among other female nurses and VADs. As the war went on, their work became busier and they were needed to help with more nursing work, including dressings, drips, comforting the dying and moving the dead. Jessie wrote, "We hear night after night the boys singing and shouting who are going up the line. They are so jolly and are going off with such a good heart. One tries not to think of the convoys which come back." Jessie was moved to work in the officers' wards, but said, "I was very sorry to leave my hut and the dear Tommies, who are really the best." There was quite a hierarchy of accommodation based on rank at the hospital. The officers were in buildings and the men were in huts. The winter of 1917 was bitter. Each 6 months, Jessie was asked whether she wanted to sign on again, which she continued to do right through the war, and she received armbands for each year that she served. The number of funerals increased, and she writes about how the size of the graveyards grew each month. But there were occasional days off, and entertainments were planned. Hay was cut, and a tennis court was built. Theatre productions were planned and performed for the soldiers, and costumes were sewn from what they could find. Jessie managed to buy a bicycle and spend her off days riding around the countryside and talking with the local French people in her fluent French. In 1917, she found that she had French relatives living quite near where she was working, and she visited them whenever she could. She was not allowed to stay overnight. They were very strict about what their staff could do. When the armistice was declared, the strict barriers between the staff were relaxed, and medical officers, nurses and VADs enjoyed playing in the winter snow. They did have a sled there, but they actually also took metal trays from the kitchens and sat on them and slid down the hills. With the influenza raging and patients unable to be moved or evacuated for weeks, hospitals had to continue, and Jessie actually stayed on until February 1919. Before she left France, Jessie went to some of the places that Australians had fought at the front and wrote about what she saw. And when she returned to Australia in 1920, she began to raise funds for the devastated villages and refugees. This is a little tiny etching there with an appeal for funds. In 1926, she travelled back to France to places she'd worked and raised funds to rebuild. And although her war experiences were not explicitly expressed in her art practice subsequent to the war, they had affected her person. She'd formed a deep bond with France and its people and continued to visit for the rest of her life. And there are still some who remember her fondly there.
Thanks very much, Alison. Among the striking features of Dyson's life and career are his conspicuous creative talent and his remarkable versatility. Dyson was born at Ballarat in 1880 and grew up in Melbourne, but struggled to find a niche in Australia despite his conspicuous talent. It was only after venturing to England in 1909 with his new wife, Ruby Lindsay, sister of his best friend, Norman Lindsay, that he became a stunning overnight success as an incisive radical cartoonist of exceptional wit and resource. He went on to become internationally acclaimed in other spheres as well. That is, This remarkable Australian with exceptional talent who could not find a congenial slot in Australia ended up internationally acclaimed as a powerful cartoonist, internationally acclaimed as a war artist, internationally acclaimed as an etcher, internationally acclaimed as a writer of prose, internationally acclaimed as a writer of verse, internationally acclaimed as a speaker, and internationally acclaimed as a humorist. As you can see, conspicuous talent and remarkable versatility. 100 years ago, Dyson became Australia's first official war artist. Other Western Front artists gravitated to colourful landscapes or scenes of dramatic action, blood and thunder bayonet charges, lethal military hardware, straining horses dragging big guns forward. Dyson's focus was different. He concentrated on the men. What he drew in his black and white sketches was much harder to draw. Exhaustion and endurance, grit and grime. He sketched Australians waiting, resting and sleeping. He captured them stumbling out of the line, drained and dazed. He drew weariness and resignation, perseverance and fatalism. Dyson revered Australia's soldiers and their achievements, but he utterly detested war. "I'll never draw a line to show war except as the filthy business it is," he told his friend Charles Bean, the Australian official correspondent at the Western Front. Dyson found the many months he spent at the Western Front harrowing for more than the obvious reasons. Bean observed that Dyson experienced at least 10 times more of the real Western Front than any other official artist, British or Australian. But it wasn't just the horrors and dangers that left Dyson feeling ripped apart. He felt inspired by the Australian soldiers' endurance and accomplishments, but at the same time he felt dismayed that a fine Australian generation was being destroyed before his eyes. Dyson was especially stirred by what they did in 1918. What the Australian soldiers did in this crucial year prompts the conclusion that Australians were influencing the destiny of the world in 1918 more than Australians had ever done before and more than Australians have ever done since. In March 1918, the Germans launched an immense offensive that drove the British back no less than 40 miles. That's 40 miles. Australian units were rushed to the rescue and were prominently involved in plugging the gaps in the British defences. These were desperate days. For the British, it was the biggest crisis of the war. There was widespread genuine concern that after years of fierce fighting, awful hardships and frightful casualties, Britain and its allies might well lose the war. The arrival of Australian formations in vulnerable sectors was inspiring and influential. Distressed French civilians, whose homes had been in the path of the German advance, were in terrified retreat, struggling along with whatever possessions they could gather or carry in the sudden crisis, often with a crying child clinging to mother's skirts. And you've got the situation transformed by the arrival of the Australians, confident, unflustered by the dismay all around them, ready to do the business and stop the Germans in the gravest crisis of the greatest war there had ever been. Many of these retreating civilians recognise the Australian uniform and they become exultant. They start raving about "Les Australiens merveilleux." Forgive those illustrious French scholars in the audience, that's meant to be the marvellous Australians. And many of these civilians actually turn around and go back to their homes because they are so confident the AIF will stop the Germans. Some of the finest national declarations in Australia's entire history are to be found here, like the reassuring words of some of these diggers to the distraught French women. "Fine retreat, madame. Beaucoup Australians, you see." no more retreat, madame, many Australians here. That's got to be one of the great all-time national statements, surely. Now, Will Dyson's drawing, Welcome Back to the Somme, is the only image I'm aware of by any artist that covers these critical and stirring events. The culmination of the Australians' contribution in this part of the war was the stunning counterattack at Villers-Bretonneux on 25 April 1918, when the key man was that redoubtable commander, General Pompey Elliott. Dyson and Bean were, typically, on the scene at Villers-Bretonneux, and Bean thought the daring counterattack, a complex manoeuvre in the dark without artillery support, was sure to fail. But it was brilliantly successful and signalled the end of the dangerous German thrust to Amiens. This triumph intensified Dyson's worship of Australian soldiers. This was very evident in a letter he wrote home shortly afterwards, which I discovered here at the State Library, and has been for a long time my favourite World War I letter of all. This is what he wrote. The boys are more eager, cheerful, bucked up and full of fight than ever before. Weather is good, food is good, and they are at the height of their reputation. What they have done is in so striking a contrast to what the others did not do. God alone knows what terrible things are coming to them, but whatever they are, they'll meet them as they've met everything in the past. These bad men, these ruffians, who will make the life of Australian magistrates busy when they return with outrages upon all known municipal bylaws and other restrictions upon the free life. They are of the stuff of heroes and are the most important thing on earth at this blessed moment. Dyson wrote about Australia's soldiers as superbly as he drew them. What I've just read was a private letter to his brother. He also produced a book called Australia at War that is little known but a classic. In this book, Dyson reproduced some of his drawings with a personal inscription on the page alongside. I've got time for only one example tonight. This is what he wrote about Deadbeat, this drawing of an exhausted young Australian soldier. He was there as we came back. I have not drawn him as childish as he looked. He had lost himself and floundered all night in shell holes and mud through the awful rain and wind. He had floundered into the cover of the tunnel and stopped there, disregarded, save for occasional efforts to assist on the part of the men. Attempts that could not penetrate through to his consciousness, past the dominating instinct to sleep anywhere, anyhow, and at any cost. He looked so very young, that quality which here has power to touch the heart of older men in the strongest way. To see going into the line boys whose ingenuous faces recall something of your own boyhood, something of someone you stole fruit with, or fought with, or wagged it with through long, hot Australian afternoons. To see them in this bloody game and to feel that their mother's milk is not yet dry upon their mouths. Internationally acclaimed as a writer as well as a war artist. And Dyson also wrote striking poetry about the Australian soldiers he so admired. There was also scope, even in the ghastly surroundings of the Western Front, for his legendary wit and repartee. After all, this is the man who remarked that England used to send criminals to Australia and we retaliated by sending artists to England. Among his 300 or so World War I drawings was this impromptu caricature of a bedraggled wet digger in the worst French winter for decades. Although it's a quick black and white sketch, the artist's skill is very evident in the inflamed nose and dripping moustache, indicating a heavy cold as this disgruntled digger ploughs through shin-deep mud and slush while rain continues to fall. He's clearly fed up with France in winter. Dyson's caption has him asking, "Isn't there ever any flamin' droughts in this country?" Dyson was not only our first official war artist, he remains, in my view, our finest official war artist. His friend and admirer Charles Bean envisaged a special space at the Australian War Memorial dedicated to displaying Dyson's works exclusively, a Dyson gallery. This never eventuated, but we do have a Dyson exhibition down the road at the Shrine right now. Thank you very much.
Well, that was a very good point to stop you, Ross, because I just want to talk about Frank Hurley, and I'll put him up here. Here's a portrait of him in uniform. Frank Hurley arrived in London in November 1916, and he was famous by this time. He'd been on 2 expeditions to Antarctica, and the second one had left just after the outbreak of First World War, and then it was marooned, and when they got back in 1916 they were all very surprised to find that the war was still going. When he arrived in London at a good point in time, Charles Bean had been lobbying to set up a war records unit in London to try and start to collate and collect some of the historical records from the battlefields. And as part of that, Bean was very keen to appoint photographers, Australian photographers, to photograph the Australian troops. So it was very much, from Bean's point of view, an idea of creating a very authentic Australian record of the progress of the war. But there were 2 people who probably should never have worked together, because Hurley was a big man. When I say a big man, he was very good at promoting himself and his work. And Charles Bean was... Ross might have a better picture of this, but he was a man who was ultimately there for the troops and Australia. And he seemed to see his work as almost a vocation to try and record the history of the war from the Australian point of view and what the troops were doing. Frank Hurley was appointed, and he was appointed with an assistant called George Hubert Wilkins. Now, he wrote a description of what he thought his job was. This is Frank Hurley. Sorry. That which came directly under my charge was the photographic section, official war records. As this name suggests, this department deals with photographic recording of operations, field of operation, personnel, and in fact all incidents of historic value or interest to the AIF. So he left for the battlefield and arrived probably, I think it was in August 1917, and he met with Bean, and he also met Dyson, who was already there with Bean. And very quickly Hurley realised that the task that he'd been set was quite onerous, to be able to take a photograph amidst the battle with the smoke, the haze, unknown kind of scenario evolving. And the cameras they carried were quite large cameras. They're on tripods. They were quite large cameras. So there was all kinds of difficulty. So he then began to think about how he could take pictures of what was happening in front of him. Bean himself was very against photographers faking action. and there were lots of ways photographers were already faking the action. There were scenes that were taken in the training camps which were passed off as images of real action. There was, they would add pieces to their negatives. They'd add clouds or shell bursts to their negatives. And they'd stage pictures away from the fierce fighting. And this was already quite common. The Canadians were doing this. But Bean described the photographs that he wanted to collect as sacred records standing for future generations to see forever the plain truth. So he was very against any kind of picture making. However, Frank Hurley saw himself as a camera artist, so he was coming from a completely different perspective. He wanted to create images from more than one negative, and also to reenact scenes and to pose scenes and to bring all of these elements together into a picture. And this quickly became quite a standoff between the two men. When they went to, when he arrived, they already knew that the Australian High Commission wanted to do an exhibition of Australian war photographs in London the following year. So Frank Bean had that at the back of his mind. And I guess his reputation and his previous career. He was thinking about how he could bring these photos and the story of the battlefields to life in his own way. So I've just got a little excerpt from his diary of one of the discussions he following a discussion with Charles Bean. This was in October 1917. He says, had a lengthy discussion with Bean re pictures for exhibition and publicity purposes. Our authorities here will not permit me to pose any pictures or indulge in any original means to secure them. They will not allow composite printing of any description, even though such be accurately titled, nor will they permit clouds to be inserted in a picture. As this absolutely takes all possibilities of producing pictures from me, I have decided to tender my resignation at once. I conscientiously consider it but right to illustrate to the public the things our fellows do and how the war is conducted. They can only be got by printing a result from a number of negatives or a reenactment. And then the following day he says, I am unwilling and I will not make a display of war pictures unless the military people see their way clear to give me a free hand. Canada has made a great advertisement out of their pictures and I must beat them. So the upshot of that was that he was just fortunately asked to go and photograph the first Anzac staff at General Headquarters, and he spoke to General Birdwood. And Birdwood then agreed that Hurley could make 6 composite images for the exhibition. And so the story continued. Now, this image here is the composite image that Hurley made for the exhibition, and it's been photographed in the studio in London. I guess the ladder gives a little bit of an idea of the height. It was about 4.7 metres high and 6 metres wide. It was made out of 12 different negatives, and details like the shell bursts, they were... that was a sort of a treatment to the actual glass plate. The planes have been montaged in from various photographs, and the lower section of the picture is actually made from 3 photographs showing a rapid sort of photo of a group of men getting out of the trench. So he's just used 2 of those images. The idea was that he wanted to bring this vivid reality of the battlefield to the public. Now, this had been done before with a very large-scale print. The Canadians had done this 2 years earlier, and in fact, when they exhibited their large prints, they in fact put an instruction to the audience of where they should stand to get the full effect of this battle. So it was not uncommon. It was actually based on a battle that happened on the 4th of October. Now, a lot of people have written about this image and Frank Hurley's composites, but basically Martin Jolly, who's written quite a lot about it, has commented that even the perspective, if you think about where Hurley might have been standing to take that image of those people coming out of the trench, he would have been very vulnerable to gunshot fire. It's implausible that he could have taken that photo in the middle of a battle, although Hurley continued to claim that he had. The day of the battle, the particular battle, was a very misty, rainy day, and there's a lot of clarity in this image. So it's definitely a reenactment to some degree and a composite print, but a wonderful work all the same. 2 more minutes. Oh my God. Oh, I'll move on. Now this is an exhibition poster by the war artist Fred Lees. And this is the exhibition that the photographs were shown in. There were in excess of 100 photographs shown and 4 very large images. As you can see, it wasn't all just about photographs. There were a group of artists who were exhibiting as well. Frank Hurley had the larger room, and the other war artists, in fact, I thought they were on the poster, but they're not. There was a group of Australian artists that were in that exhibition, and they were in another room. It was a very successful exhibition, and it was a way of promoting the war effort. Just as a postscript to that, I'll skip through. Frank Bean visits the exhibition, and Hurley has claimed himself as author or creator of most of the works in the photographic section. And Hurley is incensed. He sees it as... Bean is incensed. He sees it that Hurley is just making a career out of the war, and he felt the exhibition should have just been about the sacrifice of the soldiers and the Australians. Anyway, I'll just wrap this up quickly, but I became interested in this image because we used it in one of the films that we made for Writing the War. But at that stage, I didn't realise it was a Frank Hurley image. It was in this album here, which belonged to J.H.B. Armstrong. And what happened after the war... In fact, that London exhibition was possibly the last time photographers were ever credited in exhibitions of Australian photography from the front. When these things were exhibited in Australia, there was no credit given to photographers, and Bean was quite adamant about that. So a lot of the images that you'll find, for instance, that have drifted into albums or other collections are not necessarily attributed to anybody as a result of that. So this is this beautiful album that this soldier fought near Albert and Peronne, and he's obviously come back from the war, and he's purchased copies of exhibition prints from some of the exhibitions that were held in Melbourne after the war. Now, the other element to this is that when we made the film, the filmmakers did some wonderful things with this photograph. And I can't help but think of poor old Charles Bean not being very happy about this image from the outset. And then, if he were alive today, knowing that we'd actually use it in a film for a battle that was not related to the Battle of Zonnebank. So we'll just show that film. Thanks.
France, July 2, 1916. Dearest people, for a couple of days we have listened to an amazing bombardment, witnessed shells bursting around our aircraft, and now comes the splendid news that our boys have advanced. Hooray! We have just come off church parade. It was held in a lovely green paddock. The text was, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." During the sermon, a landmine was exploded and shook all the earth. Another was exploded during the communion which followed. The Padre spoke on these words at communion, "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies." And all the while we could hear our enemies' shells bursting.
Thank you, Alison. Now, you might wonder why we're not starting with Norman Lindsay, but in fact, with some late 17th century prints showing battles. Louis XIV carried out almost 40 years of intermittent warfare across Europe between the 1660s and the Peace of Utrecht in 1713. From 1681, when I think he was near the peak of his power as the great voice of Europe, from then on through to 1702, remarkable French printmakers published series of battle and siege scenes, some of them remarkable. Some of you who might have seen the horse exhibition at the National Gallery last year, you would have seen some of the grand conquests of the king prints in that. Grand referring not to the size of the battles, but actually to the format, the very large sheets of paper on which these prints were printed. That's another one. Now, Louis, his courtiers observed that Louis never wanted to hear anything other than good news. And the prints followed very much the same pattern. So there would be a print of a wonderful, successful French siege and taking of a town, such as Namur. But when it was recaptured by the other side, was there another print to balance the story? No, that never happened. The level of tension in the court was such that before major battles, Saint-Simon, the great diarist of the 17th or 18th century, comment on the anxiety of courtiers lest they have to report anything other than the version of events that appeared in the one national paper, the Mercure de France, which of course told the official story. Nothing other than good about the French state of affairs. After the retaking of Namur in 1695, the courtiers were so petrified of having to tell the king what he did not want to hear, he eventually sensed something was wrong, and it was an elderly bath attendant who had no face to lose who blurted the news out to the king. It must have saved some otherwise unfortunate courtier some degree of face. Well, welcome to the world of controlling the nation's impression of a war. It might surprise many Australians to realise that the first time there's an independent photographer in a war in which we're involved, it's not until Korea. Censorship was occurring on the field, and then another layer of censorship off the field when Dyson signed up as the first official war artist during the First World War. He had to sign documents saying, "I promise never to represent an actual battle." So you won't find any battle shown, even though he saw battles quite obviously, or the edges of them. Oh yes. And there was profound, I think, suspicion on the part of the government of new visual techniques such as photography and the possible power that images might have if they were simply loosed with artists allowed to represent whatever they chose. So a great deal of control of the version of events was the way we saw it here at the other end, and this is very important in looking at Norman Lindsay's war posters. Here's one. Well, most but not all that we're going to see were in fact published in 1918, the last year of the war. By then, the casualty lists, simply the casualty lists that had appeared since our involvement began on the Western Front, was making public awareness slightly change. If you were living in rural areas and there was pressure on you to give up the last young man to work the farm, yes, there were people starting to make critical noises about how well politicians made sure their sons were not sent off to the war but were given special exemptions. Yes, there were critical voices and just a sense of war weariness. But when you look at Norman's posters, what you see is basically an impression that the war is a wonderful adventure, like a boy's own annual story. It could be illustrations or something like that. None of that dogged endurance, not to mention the sheer war weariness that you see in Will Dyson. There's another one. Aren't we going to have a fun time now we're going off to the front? There is also something else, and that is there's no sense of the humanity of the other side. The ultimate origins of this particular poster lies in iconography that Norman Lindsay was already developing before the First World War. Some of you may know a journal of literature and art called The Lone Hand, and I think you'll find in a pre-war issue of The Lone Hand there is an image in which some components of that poster are already appearing, but the idea of the enemy as not a human being, but a crude-looking ape. It wasn't exclusive to Norman. In fact, it's quite interesting to note that Will Dyson, in a series of cartoons that were published under the title Culture Cartoons in, I think, 1915, thank you, I've got to get my dates correct, he has an image in there of an aerial bombardment by the Germans, and the Germans in the plane are in fact two monkeys, two apes, one of them is about to drop a bomb on, yes, the presumably civilians down below. It wasn't a new image or one that was original to Norman Lindsay, but I can't help thinking, given that one of my great-uncles was a Western Front officer who for a short period of time was in charge of a group of German internees, he became very sympathetic to the Germans, so much so he was quite sure when the war was over that he was on the right side, the only side that one should have been on. But he'd made enough contacts with those young men. He had addresses for them in the hope that perhaps after peace had descended, there might be a possibility of catching up. Well, there's none of that sense of the humanity of the other side in this sort of poster that's facing us right now, or of Will Dyson's Wine of Victory, one of those wonderful lithographs where the German prisoners of war just look like bedraggled, beaten up human beings. They're not demonised any more than Dyson's Australian soldiers are heroised. Violence, and there was a great deal of debate and a whole set of rules basically in place in terms of the censorship world of World War I, as to how much violence you could show and how far you could go. And the simple summing up of that is not very far at all. There was a British magazine, The Graphic, which at the start of the war had a cover image showing a dead officer lying at the foot of the crucified Christ. He looks as though he has fallen asleep, and there's a little tiny graze of red on his head. nothing like the real thing at all. This image is based partly on what was a totally unfounded rumour early in the First World War, that the Germans had actually crucified people literally during their invasion of Belgium. No, not a shred of evidence, but it also simply became a symbol for what was often referred to at the time as gallant little Belgium, who instead of simply capitulating meekly as was expected of the Germans, tried as much as they could to stand up. And that, of course, brought England into the war. Now, there are some interesting gaps between the real world and the world of Norman's fancy, which are simply highlighted by some other things I've already mentioned. The war weariness that had was already affecting Australia by 1918 when these posters are published. But it seems strange to me that Norman had lost a younger brother, Reg, who was killed in 1916. One can't help wondering why that mightn't have woken one up in some sense to a point where one wouldn't be producing these kind of images. Then in 1924, he published an extraordinary piece of nonsense, which is what it is, creative effort, in which he took a very reduced version of the much more sophisticated philosophies of Friedrich Nietzsche on the artist as the great Olympian above all other human beings, not responsible to others, and gifted with masculine gifts that are constantly under attack from Africans, Asians, the Jewish world, etc. Well, yes, and it's a line that he believed in for the rest of his life. If we wind forward to 1964, which some of us would remember as the year when Adolf Eichmann was tried in Israel, Norman was so in touch with reality that when the Eichmann trial was happening, he publicly responded here in Australia, well, the only trouble with people like Eichmann was they didn't do a good enough job. They should have finished them all off. That's less than 20 years after the revelation of the horrors of the Holocaust. I suspect that Norman could produce this sort of work for government commission because he always lived, to some extent, in an extraordinary fantasy world with minimal touch with reality. And I think that's what makes these posters so different in many ways from the art of Dyson. So there we are. And I will say, and I don't think it's exactly unobvious, I'm not a great admirer of Norman's personality, but I think one might have some reasonable grounds for questioning certain sides of his work. Thank you.